Professor Kettler, how are you?
I'm great. How are you doing, Matt?
I am great. I'm really pumped to have you back in the studio. You and I connected. It was like 7, 8 months ago,
It's a
something
while.
like it's been a minute. And I was also chatting with you because I was like, oh, I think I'm going to cover the legislative session this coming year. And you said, oh, well, I actually teach like state politics. You're a poli-sci professor at BSU. I actually teach state politics in spring. I'm like, oh, well, we're going to have to connect. And oh my God, we are 2/3 of the way through. I don't know if I have another 4 weeks. I think I can make it, but like we're at least 3 weeks away from being done. We're going over for sure. This is a wild time. How many legislative sessions in the state of Idaho have you seen?
I moved here in 2014, so 2015 was my first session to really watch in depth here in Idaho.
So this is your 11th session.
I guess that's right. No, 10.
Yeah, no, because
10.
2015 was 1, right? We're not starting at 0. We start at 1. That's actually an SAT question.
Your math always gets me confused. It's perhaps why I teach government and not math.
There we go. Okay, so 11 sessions, roughly 11 sessions when this one's over. Look, I got some questions for you. And okay, let's first start with, why do people even run bills? Like, let's start there, because I've counted now. I had no idea, but I've counted like at least half a dozen reasons why people run bills, and only one of them is to actually change the law.
Oh, there are so many motivations for why legislators may introduce bills, and it can vary a little bit across states depending on how the bill introduction process works. We, of course, have the routing slip process here where the committees have the print hearing before formally introducing a bill. But ideas for legislation come from a wide number of sources. Sometimes it's the legislator's own kind of personal, issue they care a lot about. Sometimes someone in the community may bring forward an issue that they would like to see addressed. Interest groups and lobbyists are another really key area of legislation. Some of them even will create model legislation that they will give to legislators as a way to kind of help with the process, because writing legislation can be difficult. So if you provide a shortcut for someone, right? Like, oh, here's a bill,
Right.
all drafted. All you have to do is like put in, little tinkering for your state. That really helps make a legislator's job a little easier, right?
But back to the motivations, all of these things are true. Let's just focus on like think tanks or PACs or things. There are at least 3 reasons that somebody would run a bill with no expectation of it getting passed just to appease a think tank. Right? Like, I'm not missing this. They might run it because the think tank is like, hey, I know this is going to be a loser, but we want you to run this to get public feedback. Or we know this is going to be a loser, but we want you to run this so that we can tell other states that you're running this bill as well. Or we want you to run this because I need to go back and tell my donors that I was able to get you to run a bill. Even if I knew it wasn't going to work, I have power over this situation. All stemming from a think tank or a PAC or a policy center getting our legislators to do other things.
All of those reasons we definitely see them happen. And for a few reasons. One, interest groups, think tanks, hire staff, hire lobbyists, and they need to be able to demonstrate they're doing something, right, to their supporters or who gives them money. And so being able to demonstrate, look, we're getting all these bills introduced is a nice kind of one way to establish or document what you're doing. But also it can take a long time to pass legislation. Sometimes bills need to be introduced several sessions before it really gets traction, before you really get it on the agenda. So legislators may, on behalf of interest groups, think tanks, other actors, introduce legislation they know won't pass this session, may not even get much attention or focus, but over time, maybe you finally get the policy window opens, and then there's an opportunity to really get it on the agenda to get it passed. So it can be hard for people who want to change policy. It can take a long time, but you kind of do that groundwork, right? Sometimes. So, okay, this is going to fail for a couple sessions, but over time, we may open the door enough to get it through.
I hadn't even considered that you're essentially priming the legislative body to be comfortable with this idea, or getting their feedback. So, I mean, obviously getting feedback and tweaking it is part of this process, right? But even getting them comfortable with it, or getting the populace comfortable with it, it's like, oh yeah, they run this, like I've heard about this. So you have the first year where it's a shock and everybody's like, oh, you could do that, like school choice. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, school choice. It's always been a discussion, and like, I guess it's working this year or something like that.
Right. And you can kind of build support for it over time in a few ways. One of which might be through elections. So you work to get allies elected or to defeat opponents to the legislation, like we saw for advocates for private school choice, for some of these, like the tax credit that we saw pass this session. They worked in some of these elections, right, to help kind of build numbers.
But when you say they worked, what do you mean?
I mean, spending money, right,
gotcha.
in key primary races to try to ensure that either they're electing people who would be supportive of some of these types of proposals, or opposing legislators they knew were kind of key gatekeepers on that type of legislation.
I don't mean to go down a rabbit hole, but there's another play that I want to ask you about, which is you're saying, hey, we're going to support key legislators that like this. Okay, that's fine. And we're going to not support key legislators that don't like this. There's a different negative approach that is emerging in the state of Idaho, which is we're not for anyone. We're just showing how aggressively we can be against this person. You saw that Secretary of State Phil McGrain came in and articulated the race with Melissa Wintrow that she went through, and she raised something like $37,000, which is he was like 20 to 40 is pretty standard. I mean, 37's on the upper range. Her opponent raised, I think, $2,500. So not even close as far as, support from the populace and whatnot. And then out of state opposition raised almost $100,000. Now, this opposition was not for her opponent. The opposition was literally just anybody but Wintrow. Or, excuse me, not Wintrow, Durant. Did I say Wintrow originally? Yeah. Oh my gosh, Melissa Durant. My God, I'm terrible. I'm sure Melissa Wintrow also got bad stuff. But you know who I'm talking about, right? Melissa Durant. Yeah. Why don't you stop me? You're like, it's Durant, you idiot.
I was just kind of waiting to see where we were going. I was like, maybe I overlooked something. But...
No. And again, not Senator Wintrow. It was Melissa, former Representative Melissa Durant. But again, that was a problem where you're not even seeing support for one person or another. You're just showing efficacy with do what we want. And the only benefit you get is we won't turn on the engine and focus it against you.
Yeah, and I think we are seeing like some organizations this really being their strategy. And this is where independent spending or outside expenditures can kind of play a role here. And that a lot of that money is spent on negative advertising, whether it's television ads or mailers. We saw a lot of mailers attacking incumbents. And so they're really focused on, as you were saying, attacking the incumbent one way or another without necessarily having anyone they're supporting, but just really framing that incumbent's job, right? Casting, raising concerns
Doubts.
about different things they had done or hadn't done in office.
Okay. Is this a newer thing, or is the level of support for this strategy an evolving kind of shape? Because I have not been in politics like you or studying it, but it is one thing where it's like, whoa, this is really intense.
Yeah, I think there's a few things, and I do think it is increasing in the amount of money spent on it and like the prevalency of it. If we go back to like the 2010 Citizens United Supreme Court decision, that really was kind of the start of striking down a lot of restrictions on independent expenditures. And so that opened the door for making it easier for like super PACs to emerge, or things that can fundraise unlimited amounts and spend it independently in elections. Some states allowed independent expenditures before that decision, so that alone wasn't like a complete change in the states. But what we've just seen now, more and more organizations know about this approach to spending money in elections, right? And some of those restrictions have fallen aside. So it's easier for organizations to fundraise massive amounts of money and then spend it independently in elections. And what we've seen is some states like Idaho seem to be attracting more attention from organizations outside the state, perhaps because it's viewed that Idaho elections are pretty cheap compared to some states. And so maybe you can have a pretty large impact without spending near as much as you might in like Texas, for example.
Or Florida or something like that. Right. And then you can show political efficacy, right? Like you're essentially saying like, I capacity built, I can do these things, continue donating to me, whatever the PAC is, getting the donations from, the billionaire class.
Right. And potentially helping, set the stage for an issue to have more success when it's on the agenda, either by ensuring people are elected that support your issue or getting rid of opponents.
Right. And then whoever replaces them knows, oh my gosh, the only reason I won is because this person went against issue X. And if I go against issue X, they're going to do the same thing to me. They're going to get the $100,000 mailers or campaign things against me and go from there.
Yeah, it can provide quite the threat, right? The kind of external threat. And I think for some legislators, they may not, they may be secure enough one way or another that they're like, I'm not too worried, kind of bring it on. But for other legislators who maybe still have a lot of goals they want to achieve or have, are really motivated for, representing their constituents, whatever that might be, it might be enough to be like, well, I don't really like this, but I'm really willing to kind of compromise and support it. No, trying to prevent some of these other outcomes.
I love that our legislators are compromising with the outside agencies. Like that's who has the hammer over them. An individual citizen like me, I can't get a legislator to compromise with me because they're like, well, okay, what are you going to do if I don't? Like, you're just one dude. And it's like, yeah, I'm a nobody. But if I'm like, hey, I got $100,000 of mailers that are going to go against you, right? And I don't even live in the state. I live somewhere else. Do what I want or stop doing what I don't like or whatever it is. Like, man, that makes my blood boil.
And I do want to say, like, I'm drawing, and, this is from aggregate research that I'm not speaking individually about any particular Idaho legislators. It's just what we see in the research, how things can play out and why these groups feel that this is effective money, that they can have influence on. And this speaks to some broader points about the importance of state government, and that as we've seen kind of gridlock in DC and other factors, that the state governments have really emerged as really powerful policy players, right? Passing a lot of policy, kind of even growing power in different ways, so that as citizens, our state government has a large influence on us, right? And so groups, actually there were a lot of organizations that shifted resources from lobbying Congress to the states starting about a decade or so ago, because they realized that there was so much more opportunity in the states than what they were going to have in DC.
That makes so much sense. And you're right. Like you can effectively do things at the state level where it's like Congress is just a gridlock train wreck. So they're like, forget it. Why are we spending $50 million in Congress and not getting anywhere? Let's just take $5 million to Idaho and we will absolutely affect Idaho.
Yeah. And one thing we also saw starting about a decade or so ago is a lot of states have unified partisan control. So the same party controls both the legislature and the governor's seat. And so they were set up well to pass a lot of policy. Back decades ago, we saw more divided control in states. And so you could see a lot of gridlock, or at least more bipartisanship or compromise. But once we got to, 2/3 of states with unified partisan control, it's like, oh, there's an opportunity and they can get things done.
Here's a question for you. And again, I stay neutral on these things. In fact, I will take a position on the school choice thing. I actually don't care about educational contractors. And I keep repeating this to people. I was in private education. I was an SAT tutor. I believe that there's the ability to have a positive service effect somewhere else. But I also relate it to landscaping, which is like, listen, if you and I are in charge, we're the maintenance people at the Capitol, and we're like, all right, look, I got my landscaping crew. Every 2 weeks, they have to cut the grass down to 1.5 inches, and every 2 months, they got to fertilize, and that's it. And then somebody comes to us and like, well, can you at least put this out to bid and see if we can do it better or cheaper? Right. I'm like, okay, no problem. So you and I, the maintenance people, we go out to the landscaping people. And we're like, hey, here's the deal. We have $5,000 for you to do this landscaping, but you got to cut it to 1.5 inches every 2 weeks, and you got to fertilize every 2 months. And then the private industry gets to say, Okay, is it worth it for me? Can I make money? Like, boom, can I efficiencies? Like maybe at scale, like, can I get all the contracts? And then maybe we have that conversation. But what happened with schools is, all right, schools, you have to every 2 weeks, inch and a half, and you got to fertilize every 2 months. Public schools. By the way, you can get this $5,000 private school. You just do it however the customers want it, right? Like whoever comes to your park, just listen to them. And as long as they're happy, I don't care how frequently you cut the grass. Like it does. You never want to fertilize, no glyphosate, pull the weeds, doesn't matter to me. You do you, private landscape. Like that to me is like, well, that's not, educational contractors. Contractors do the same. But my point is, we have a bill. We have the school choice, right? That passed. And okay, no problem. None of my affair. And when it went to the governor, the craziest thing that I ever heard was like, they're like, well, let's hear from the people. It's like, why? And then the data comes back and it was overwhelmingly people that called in did not want it, like 6-1 or something ridiculous like that. And the law passed anyway. And a lot of people talk to me on and off air. They're like, why? Like, why have that? Why have that call in? If it was clear what the call-in wanted, why not follow what the people wanted? Like, what do you think? Like, what is that? And again, I'm not saying I liked it or not liked it. I'm just wondering, like, it seems clear the only metric we have for what actual people wanted was the call-in. And the call-in was overwhelmingly, don't do this. And then it got done.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question that, for example, students ask me a lot. Like, why does it seem like legislators or policymakers ignore what the public wants when we do have signals like this, where it looks like, and in this case, overwhelmingly, the public data that we have was against it. And I think there's a few things that can play a role here. One of which is, for some policymakers, they may be like, well, the constituency I'm most concerned about, I don't think are the people showing up to the committees to provide testimony, or they're not the ones calling in. So, my core constituency, who's going to help reelect me, I think they think differently on this issue.
So the people that have most effect on my future political career, something like that. Or let's say the people that would be most affected by this, which let's say, and we don't have this data at all, but like, let's say there were 6,000 people that called in that actually were like, yes, this is a good idea. And we knew somehow that they were all parents of children that were engaged in education currently. And then, so let's say we had 20,000 people that called in that said, don't do this, but they're not people with kids. So you have to, essentially, it sounds like you're saying you got to qualify, will this affect my career? And are these people that will be most concerned with the outcome of this law?
Right. So thinking about both kind of the political factors as well as
application.
Right. And like, so, and you hear this a lot with talking about who shows up to testify at committees. Like we're in Boise, we're in the Treasure Valley. So I think some legislators may question whether or not all the people showing up to testify are they actually their constituents, right? Are they people who live in the area and maybe back home people think differently? I will say the research finds that a lot of legislators can struggle to know what public opinion is, what public opinion holds on different issues, especially in a state where we don't have a whole lot of public opinion polling. Like it can be difficult to know for sure what a lot of people might think. But when we have examples like this, where we had so many people calling in to and opposed to the bill, I do get these questions of like, well, why don't they listen to us? Well, it's possible that they're thinking about different constituencies or think their constituency holds a different perspective, or they think, they're kind of prioritizing some other things in their decision making.
Some other things?
Well, which could be a variety of elements, right?
A lot of different things.
A lot of different things. Because it could be your party. Is this a party goal? Is this in your party platform? Like maybe you personally don't agree with it, but you think it's important for the party to achieve its key goals for either the party's reputation or how voters assess the party. So that could be an important consideration. There could be deal-making discussions, right? Like, I don't like this, but if I support this, does this mean that a bill I care a lot about is going to be successful?
That nature of compromise in politics is just so crazy, because it's like, okay, what's the right thing to do? Oh, the right thing to do is say no. But if I say no, and we both agree that's the right, and I'm not saying this bill, but like in general, it's like whatever the imaginary bills, it's like the right thing to say is no. But if I don't, then I don't get this other thing. And I really like this. So I'll go with it. It's like, but the right thing to do is say no. It's like, well, I know, but.
And we do have some legislators that will, and sometimes they'll even be like, this is a tough vote for me. I'm going to vote no because my conscience, or I know that my core, my district doesn't like it, even though maybe I think, like you do have variations across legislators and kind of how they make these decisions. But there's actually some people have argued that in terms of Congress, that one thing that might help it work better is a little bit of less transparency. That maybe if they could make more behind the door, deals, that maybe they could come together a little bit more. Of course, that opens up all sorts of other possible questions and concerns.
Don't you think they're already doing that? I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
All the times I've watched testimony, with the exception of no, pretty much every time. Anytime something goes to the House or to the Senate, full body, and they're voting on it, anytime somebody gets up there and says something, it's like everyone in this room already knows how they're voting. Well, it's not determined in the public sphere. We vote in the public arena. We know how people we know what people say, but I don't believe that any of that information was determined and processed and grappling with it on the floor. They're like, oh gosh, I'd never thought about this. It was that doesn't happen.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, that it seems like most of our debates on the floors of our legislatures, whether it's the state legislature, whether it's Congress, by time we're getting to the floor debate, we know how people are going to vote for the most part, right? On a lot of issues, just because of the role parties and the party caucuses play in terms of shaping what happens by that stage. I think it's back in the committee stages, things like that, where you might be able to see more, whether it's across party lines or ideological lines, more kind of policy deliberation and deal making, things like that.
Gosh, it's so crazy. And again, last time we spoke, I had never followed politics at all. And now, oh my, I feel like we have this inside track to the happenings of the government. It's if more people knew, this is how it worked.
Well, and I think that for a lot of people, for some of us, we find the internal workings, how the sausage gets made, really fascinating, right?
Sure.
I think it's incredibly interesting in how legislators are making their decisions, because a variety of things can influence it. But I think a lot of people don't. I think it's very, right? They're turned off by it. It seems messy. It seems potentially gross. And so I think for
it's
some,
upsetting.
it can be upsetting. Yeah. Why are you compromising in this way?
Right.
And things like that. Or why aren't you just getting things done, or whatever the concern might be. So I think for some people, they're I don't have an interest in knowing more about what they're doing. But I also think it can be really hard sometimes for people to kind of find out that information. Not to suggest this isn't we have media coverage, things like that, but more if you don't already have some of the kind of knowledge of how things work, what the terminology means, things like that, if you don't have some of the contextual information, it can seem very overwhelming to try to figure this all out, especially once we get to March of a session. And so many things are happening, right? A bunch of bills are being debated, voted on. We're working on appropriation bills, all these things. It can be hard for those of us that pay a lot of attention to keep up. It can be really difficult, I think, for a lot of Idahoans to be wait, what's happening now? Or what's the status of this bill? Or what's going to be voted on this week? It can get a little overwhelming.
Man, you know what I've been actually thinking is it would be a good idea, every year, right before the legislative process kicks off in January, to just sit down and have a conversation and be all right, look, keep this all in mind, because you're going to get for instance, here's another reason people run bills, because it's always better if you're trying to pick somebody up at the bar to have an ugly friend with you. This is statistically apparently a thing. Now look, I don't know, I met my wife really young and got married and great, but it is my understanding, there were clips about this 10 years ago. They're listen, if you this is what you need to do. You always have to have the friend that you're slightly better looking than, because you would be the better alternative if somebody's considering considering like, do I like either of these two guys or something like that, right? Which makes me wonder why people invited me out at times. But again, no looking back. My point is that in I remember the first 2 weeks of this year, people were coming in, they're like, oh my God, like what a train wreck in a dumpster fire getting dumped into a volcano this was. And then as time went on, all of these super crazy bills gave way to different revisions, gave way to a final product that people were like, yeah, look, like most people are happy with this. But it started out with like the dumpster fire. And it's almost like, listen, just sit down for a second, like give it a couple weeks, pretend like the session actually starts 2 weeks from now, and then look at those bills, right? If you want to look at what people are prioritizing, yeah, pay attention to the first 2 weeks, but those are not the bills that they're actually trying to get across. That's just their thing for this year, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. That we, and that's part of the policy deliberation process, right? Like, let's have
The ugly bill
ideas introduced, discussed, and maybe that won't get that much attention at all, or maybe no attention, depending on who the committee chair is. But like, okay, let's start having what ideas are out there. Okay, now let's kind of deliberate what do we want to be on the agenda? What do we want to deal with? How might we address this issue? Maybe we're going to have several different bills and then try to figure out and discuss, oh, it turns out this doesn't work, or this would be a big problem. Well, let's come back together, revise. And so we want that policy deliberation and discussion, right? And also this can happen after a bill's passed. Maybe we need to revisit it down the road. Oh, it turns out this isn't working very well, or maybe we do need accountability in this way, or whatever it might be. And so ideally, once we pass something, we continue to revisit it down the road to see, is it working? Is it not working? What needs fixed? But of course, that part of the process can be a bit challenging, especially if you don't have a lot of time or resources.
Yeah. And they weaponize the deliberation process, right? Like, for instance, Representative Vanderwoude ran the Medicaid expansion repeal right out of the blocks, and a lot of people got upset. Then came another bill that was like, okay, we're going to reform Medicaid expansion. And I had Representative Alana Rubel came in, and she was like, okay, this is literally like, you can keep Medicaid expansion if you can fly a unicorn, fart in a rainbow to the moon and back. She's like, there's no way. And then, of course, like a week or two ago, we get a completely different reform bill that everybody's like, yeah, like it's mostly good. Like it's no problem. But along the way, people were voting for or against these things. And so whoever voted against, let's say the second iteration, it's like you were against Medicaid expansion reform. And the person's like, let's say it was me. Like I vote against it. And then I vote for it at the end. I'm like, no, I didn't. No, I voted for it. They're like, this is your vote, right? You voted against Medicaid expansion reform. I'm like, I voted against that version. And then of course on the mailers, doesn't want Medicaid expansion reform, wants to bloat the budget. So weaponizing the deliberation process, it's like, dude, unless you're following the Medicaid expansion reform process, repeal or reform, like drama, you would never know where people actually ended up on it.
I think that is an important point. And we see those claims all the time in mailers, television ads, right? Like so-and-so voted against this. And then it's like, oh, well, the context is they ultimately voted this way, or it changed across time. Or I think you're exactly right. And that's where kind of the the information on our ads isn't all sometimes like, well, technically correct, but is missing really important contextual information that would be important for voters to understand. So you're right. Like that is, and we see those claims all the time, and where, and it can be tough for an incumbent to be like, okay, well, I'm trying, can't let me fully explain what happened here.
Okay, hang on a minute. Can you just give me a minute?
I know, but it's never going to be as like quick and easy as that claim that came out on the ad. And so I think that can definitely be a factor here, which is one reason why in a lot of legislatures you have key gatekeepers like a committee chair or a floor, leader who's like, well, I'm just not going to put this on the agenda because I don't want my party members to have to take a vote on this. That might hurt them.
Oh, that's why committee chairs table bills.
Well, it could be one reason. Just be like, I don't want them
to have to go on record for or against this. So I'm just not even going to bring this one. Oh my gosh.
And I will say
this is crazy.
And it will depend on who the committee chair is, because some committee chairs or like speakers of the houses or things will be very cautious about they don't want any, they don't want to move forward legislation that might be a controversial vote that could harm their own party members. Other leaders will be like, no, I want to push things. I want to see how far we can go. And so are much more willing to be like, yeah, like maybe this won't pass, but let's try.
Let's find out. Let's see what the heck happens. God, this is so wild. And like, this is why, honestly, have a 1 month in, I was like, this is why I'm not a politician. Like, I'm not. But I do think that what this has reinforced in me is a decrease of anxiety. Like, going through this for sure. And you seem to have this like just zen, like, hey man, like but knowing now, even if you follow like Medicaid or repeal, it's like, okay, so like all of that concern you had about the repeal or whatever, like if I was worried about it, it doesn't, like, it's okay. It's going to work out.
And I think that for those of us who study or spend a lot of time watching legislatures, we do sometimes have this like, well, let's wait and see, right? There's a lot of gatekeepers. There's a lot of steps to get through. So like, let's see how things play out. I will say, if you're someone who's on Medicaid, regardless, is going to be threatening, right? Like it's a little hard to be like, well, okay, maybe it won't pass. If it's like, well, this is going to directly affect me, that's much harder from that individual's perspective to be like, well, okay, I'll wait. I think so. It probably does depend on how directly the proposal might affect you.
Oh yeah. There's no, I mean, look, 100%. And I'm not trying to not sympathize with people that like, but there are bills. My gosh, I have a bill that's going through. It's getting heard in the Senate Ed Committee tomorrow. I'm very excited. It's awesome. It's a parent tech awareness bill because in the state of Idaho right now, we pass out hundreds of thousands of pieces of technology, some of which we know have actually been included in predation and like child harm, right? So these are harming public school children in the state of Idaho. We know that for a fact. We could call Sheriff Clifford right now with the Ada County Sheriff Office, and he would confirm that he has Chromebooks and technology from the surrounding school districts. Like that's just a fact. So there's a tech bill saying, hey, you can pass out these pieces of technology 100%, but you just have to warn and educate parents about what you're doing. Like that's super reasonable. You're passing out a piece of technology that you have actual knowledge that puts children at risk. Okay, can you just warn the parents? We do this with everything. And going through the process. So again, it had to go through legal something services. Yeah, right.
Legislative services.
There you go. So you have to go through. This is the start of the bill. So I get this written up, right? I'm like, wow, it's written up. Then it has to go through legislative services to get revised. Then I have to take it to different stakeholders. So I have to take the State Department of Education, the PTA, the Idaho School Boards Association. All are like, they give input, but it was very little input. They're like, this looks great. Like, awesome. Here we go. So you get it revised, and then you have to have the hearing where it gets the, what's the RS number stand for?
Routing slip.
Routing slip. There you go. So before it even gets a routing slip, an RS number, and officially enters into like the bills that people vote on, you have to have like a decision, a hearing process where people were like, okay, do we like this or not? It's like, boom. So this one went through in the Senate Ed Committee, and it was literally like, there are 3 bills. And I think it was Senator Ward Ankelking was like, I moved to pass all 3. They're like, second, great, boom, done. And it was a 2-second process. I come back for the actual Senate hearing in the Education Department or Education Committee. And man, I deeply care about this bill. I think parents in Idaho should be informed. And I was white knuckling the chair.
Yeah.
And it's like, even when people were asking very reasonable questions, I was like, I couldn't even breathe. So yeah, like these things are, and it did pass, right? Unanimously passed out of the committee, and then it passed the Senate. So it's going to the House. But yeah, like these are really, I understand that it's hard when something really directly affects you. But at the same time, it's like, we need to have a level of civility surrounding our political apparatus so that we can be passionate. Like there were people that, Senator Nichols in committee, she voted for it. On the Senate floor, she took a 60-second explanation, explained why she didn't like it, and she voted against it. I'm not going to her house to picket. I'm not meeting her in the parking lot. I'm not even okay, you liked it, you didn't like it, okay, right? But the passion and impact that we have, I feel like, is bleeding over into these really aggressive actions towards our political representatives. And that's dangerous.
Yeah, we have different studies that have been coming out demonstrating that, assaults, aggressiveness, whether it's verbal or physical, has been increasing against elected and other public officials at the state and local level. And for some, they're like, this is like politically right? Like it's politically focused. It's, there's a variety of different ways that it can kind of come about. But I think that there's been kind of a long-term, for many kind of observers, a concern that fewer and fewer people will want to run and serve in these positions, because at least here in Idaho, you don't get paid a lot. Like, it takes up a lot of time. And so, like, if you're, facing like aggressiveness or a lot of pushback, it's like, okay, well, that makes it a lot harder for people to potentially want to run and serve. So that's kind of connected to that concern. I will say, I think going back, one thing you're really nicely illustrating is fully understanding the process can help better understand, like, well, why is this happening on this bill, right? And I think one thing I think that also your bill, the bill you're supporting, demonstrates is how important it is for when people really care about something to have someone to work hard for that bill and follow it through the process, right? Because it takes work to get it. Even bills that pass really easily, someone has to be going along the way and saying, here's why you need to support this. Right. Here's why it's a good bill.
Right, man. And you gotta, again, if people don't think anyone cares, like it's just so clear to me now, seeing the process of like bringing in stakeholders, beating up the bill, revising it, presenting it to people, having conversations where you leave and you're just hitting your head. You're like, why doesn't this person get it? And it could be a number of reasons. And there could be, I had Senator Shippian just yesterday or the day before, and the whole conversation centered around what's the proper role of government? That's a really big, like, what is the proper role of government? And so in fact, after the Senate vote on this bill, I did speak with somebody for like a half an hour. And this particular senator she said, look, I categorically do not like to tell schools and school districts what to do unless it's like someone's gonna die. Right now, that's really hard to swallow, but she's like, this is not a state matter. Now, my opinion is obviously it is a state matter because the state has liability, right? The State Department of Education is funding technology that they send out, that they, fund technology at the school district level. They distribute it. It goes all the way up to the state, right? And so, we have a difference of opinion there, or the propriety of this. And some people might say, well, look, you're not even addressing the problem. If the problem is dangerous tech, how do we make the tech less dangerous? Like, let's eliminate the danger instead of just acknowledging that we have danger. It's like, okay, that's a play. That's a position. I get that. But man, what a wild process you have to go through to actually make something change.
But I'm so glad that you had that conversation, right? So that you both could better understand, well, you actually have some shared values probably. You want to both protect kids and things like that.
Yeah.
But you have very different perspectives on what the role of government is, or whose responsibility this should be, or how we might approach this problem. I think there's so much more of a problem when people won't have any conversations and even try to find where they might have shared concerns and just won't have any of those conversations. Whereas even if we know, we're probably not going to get on the same page on this particular bill, but moving forward, we know where we have some shared values. And that means that we could still potentially work together down the road and maybe find on different issues where we can work together.
Yeah. Like, what I've been thinking about for the last week is that people get mad at me that I talk to both sides. Both sides are mad. It's like I have, Representative Heather Scott in, the left gets mad. I have, Representative Alana Rubel in, and the right gets mad. Like, everybody gets mad at Matt. And what kills me is just like, listen, you've been married for a minute. I've been married for a minute. Is there anything else to be done when you get in a fight with your spouse aside from like, get it together and eventually sit down at the table? Is like, what do you want? Like, what's your problem? Like, you gotta find out, what do you need? Okay. Like, I need this, you need this, we're in conflict. Like, how are we going to work this out? Like, there's no other option, right? Like, am I wrong? Like, I'm not a marriage counselor, but like, you got to do that eventually and just talk to the person.
Right. I mean, you really have to kind of understand what the concern is, right? What the other perspective is, or and how can we move past this, or how do we resolve the challenge? And I do think that, I see this with students. It comes up here and there that for some students, they are really open and they want to learn about all the different perspectives and engage with people from different perspectives. And other students find it very hard to really, it's emotionally hard for them to kind of engage, whether it feels like an attack or, whatever the case might be. And I've seen this from a variety of perspectives, but I do think there's, for some people, it's just easier and they're more open to it than other folks. But I do think when you're in public positions, when you're crafting policy is going to be better when we have a lot of perspectives included, right? We can identify where there might be an issue. We can find other solutions, things like that. So we really do want people across the aisle talking to each other, even if they're always going to disagree on some of these core values. Where are their shared values? Where do we care about, what are some of the things that we all care about and can work together?
When we're speaking about care about, okay, like what are things we care about? I think the question ultimately comes back to, why do we care about these things? Because ultimately, who are we working for? Who are we serving as elected representatives, right? Like, I may care about this as a person, but I also care about not having $100,000 of attack ads coming after me. So like, ultimately, like, do you still feel that our elected representatives predominantly serve Idaho constituents? Or do you think that there is a shift happening where they still serve us, but they're also beholden to other powers?
I think for me to personally assess that is a little hard. Like, I just, I like to have better evidence to make a conclusion or evaluation on that. I think that
well, how about this? Do you think more people are serving parties or serving constituents?
Well, I think that we know parties play a major role in all of our legislatures and how they operate, and whether or not it's going to affect every single legislator's behavior on every single thing. The party's structure, right, our chambers and how they work, and the different, the proposals, what's moving forward, things like that. So we know that parties have a major influence on our legislators, whether it's their perspectives, the issues they work on, the voting behavior. I do think being a legislator is hard. Like, it's challenging, right? Because you are trying to balance a lot of different demands on your positions, on what you're spending time on. And so legislators, often we talk about kind of a scale that legislators will differ in terms of they're more of a delegate, where they believe that they are there to represent their constituents, their voters, and that is the main thing they need to follow, is what their district wants them to do. At the other end, you have what we refer to as trustees, that are legislators that believe their voters trust them to make the best decision for them. That may align with what public opinion is, it may not. And most legislators are going to be somewhere in the middle, right? And it may even vary on issues depending on whether they're prioritizing public opinion or other sorts of elements, whether it be the political party or an interest group or a key community organization or business or whatever that might be, right? And different issues will have different kind of stakeholders involved trying to push for different things. I will say, of course, that especially if you're thinking about the primary electorate, like, a lot of those people are strong party members. So they're not probably going to be upset if their legislators are following the party agenda on a lot of issues. Though we do see internal party divisions emerge on some issues, right? And so it's not like every single issue, every single bill has 100% Republican or Democratic support.
Do you ever get invited to election night parties?
You mean like held by the parties?
Yeah.
I I don't generally get invited. And I don't usually I don't really attend because I'm usually doing other things.
Yeah, listen, I'm like I never go out of the house. Like I get invited to things all the time. I'm like, I'm not leaving my house because I'm in my studio or I'm playing with my kids. Like I'm not a very social guy, right? Like I get there, too many people, I get nervous.
Which is hilarious that like how many people you're talking to, Matt.
You know, it's so funny. People bring that up. It's like, but it's just me and you. We're going to sit here and like, I wish we could be drinking coffee in my other studio, you know, like the coffee and stuff. But it's like, I love talking to people and hearing you. Like you're getting amplified in my head. And it's like, I find it fascinating. And like, I have ideas and you have ideas. And it's like, that's so cool. Making small talk and meeting people and like I get a drink. I'm like, give me a G&T, hold the G. Because like I feel bad not having a drink, but I also don't want to drink. Like it's not like I've never have alcohol, but it's like especially when I'm meeting people, it's like this is not the time to like let my hair down. Right? Like I don't even know these people. It's like I'm sitting there drinking tonic like an idiot. Like I'm terrible in public. But speaking of party division, I'll get invitations to both the Republican election like parties. It's like, wait, one's at the Riverside and one's at Topgolf. Like. I don't know what.
I mean, but you're exactly right. This is a really interesting indication of some of the splits we have, right? That we are having that one party has multiple different election night parties that kind of center around their faction.
Right. And like who the operatives are for this party and who the operatives are for this party and like all these and they both do not like each other. And it's like you're in the same party. You know what this articulated to me clearly this year is we don't have a monoparty system. We have in name what like a dominant party. But people are people, and you get enough people together and you're going to have different groups that don't agree with you. Yeah, they all call each other. You know what we should do? We should get all the Democrats to just all be Republicans. And then we literally would just like, okay, now you're going to have to actually understand who the person is because they're all Republicans. Right now we have to go down to the level of individual voting records. We have to go down to the individual, like we're all quote conservatives or we're all whatever. Like you don't get that title means nothing anymore. And effectively that's kind of how it is anyway. Because if you're in a Republican dominated area, then like everybody's running Republican and the primary is the only election that matters.
Right. And I mean, that is one effect of or outcome of having really large, two really large political parties nationally, like that we don't have. And there's a few reasons we have a two-party system in the US, but they're so big that there can be a lot of diversity within. We don't. We see these factions play out in Congress too, right? Where you have multiple different kind of ideological groupings in both parties and sometimes those internal party divisions are as deep and as nasty as the fighting across party lines, right? Because then it's like really personal because they're like, no, the party needs to do this or the party needs to do that.
It's so great. It's the best. Listen to me, Professor Kettler, I really appreciate you. Thank you for coming in today. Listen, we got to do this again. Let's do a wrap up right like as you get off of your semester, just seeing how everything plays out. Because everybody's saying this is going to go to mid-April. So we have at least like another month left. You'll be like just a few weeks away from finals. So like you get through your finals and then like let's do one wrap of like the legislative process and review leading into, what's wild? We have elections every single year. It's like in November, you're going to have like city council people, mayor people, and then like you got governor's races, you got school board members. It's like, it's always like we have elections like crazy.
It's always election time.
It's always, and which means everybody's campaigning all the time. It's going to be wild. Yeah. Anyway, is there anything you'd like to hit here at the end before we call it?
Always great to chat with you. I appreciate the people are interested, engaged in providing additional opportunities for them to hear from elected officials, I think is really great because it can just help people understand what is their job and what are they doing and why might they think this? Because we've covered there's so many different influences or pressures on our policymakers. So being able to hear from them and their experiences or what their thinking process is so valuable.
Oh, yeah. I feel so lucky that the legislators that have come in and talked to me, they're like, okay, I'll do it. because I don't edit unless I make a really bad joke, which happens, but I don't edit. And it's like, they don't know what I'm going to ask. They don't even know what we're going to talk about. And they ask me that sometimes. I'm like, I don't know, come on in, man. Like, we'll talk about whatever committees you're on and go from there. Yeah. It's been so cool to be able to hear directly from them. You don't have to read an article. There's no filtering mechanisms. Like, no, man, this is the person in the flesh for 45 minutes, just shooting the breeze about whatever. You can see their facial expressions. You can see how they're sitting. You can see the level of attention they're giving. Like, you can see everything about them. And it's very cool.
Well, and I think it humanizes in a way that can be really impactful. Because I think for my students often are like, well, it's this, I don't really like it feels so distant, even though it's just across the river. It's like very distant. And it's easy to think of our policymakers in an entirely different world. And so then like, oh, they're human, just like me. They're trying to wade through all sorts of things. They're going to make mistakes just like me too. I think that can be helpful for connecting as well.
You know what I did? You don't know. I'm going to tell you. I agree with you that I view these people differently now. And I've gotten to know some of them, and on key, very difficult votes, I've actually texted some of them and been like, man, you have a really hard job.
Yeah.
Because people don't know why you've done what you've done. It's going to be very hard to express it. I know you made some people mad. And thanks for, doing what you got to do for Idaho. Thanks for representing Idaho. Not even like I agree or disagree, but like, damn it, man, you have a really hard job and it's very public and people are very passionate about it. And it's like, you're never going to make everybody happy. And I just appreciate that they put their hand in the fire.
Yeah.
Even if I don't agree with how they work, it's like they're putting their hand in the fire, man. Like, you go up on the fire and you're like, that's crazy time. Yeah. And we just get to sit here and talk trash about it. God bless you. Professor Kettler, thank you for coming. Let's do it again.
Of course. Anytime.